Okay, so today we got like Scott Greenberg. I know him from a book club or like online book club, like Daniel Yu host. Shout out to Daniel Yu. And I'm gonna let you introduce yourself. Okay, Scott.
Okay. Okay. So first of all, thanks for having me on here. This is great. So like you said, I've I've been a physical therapist now for going on almost 25 years, of which most of my time has been spent at the University of Florida. At the University of Florida, I wear a couple of hats. I wear the hat that allows me to treat the Gator athletes. I've been doing that since the mid 2000s. I manage operations for our outpatient rehab department, and I direct our two residency programs, orthopedics and sports. So I'm just happy to be here, and I love to talk all things sports. Specifically, my areas of expertise, I'd say, when I say expertise in air quotes, my areas of expertise would be the foot and ankle, running mechanics, lower extremity stuff. So, yeah, happy to be here and look forward to a chat.
Cool. So uh when you work with like track athletes, do you let's say sprinters and jumpers, do you like help or like do you try to like look at their sprint mechanic?
That's a great question. And I will say the biomechanical work I do with my track and field athletes tends to be more with the distance team. I tend to have a lot more expertise, we'll say, in distance running as opposed to sprinting. And I am extremely fortunate to have the opportunity to work with probably one of the best sprint coaches in the world in Mike Mouse Holloway. And so I let him really concentrate on all of the fundamentals of sprinting, and I just stay in my lane there, and I do my rehabilitation for the athletes that come my way from that side of the equation. But yeah, I'm extremely fortunate to be surrounded by some amazing athletes and some amazing coaches between him and you mentioned the jumps, Coach Nick Peterson, amazing jump coach, going to be the Olympic jump coach this year in Paris. So again, I'm extremely fortunate for the people I get to spend my day with.
Cool. Cool. So for the sprinters and jumpers, what are some like common injury that you see and yeah, how do you like treat it?
Okay. So I'd say specifically with the jumpers, I have a whole host of jumpers I'm working with right now, of which many of which we'll see in Paris in the next couple of months. Um, I'd say the biggest thing we see with that I see with my group is tendon issues, whether it be patellar tendon or Achilles tendon. Those are the big ones, and you can see why, especially if you're talking, triple jump specifically is really tough on those tendons. Some of which have been, torn and needed repairing. Others are just, really damaged and suffer from tendinopathies, etc. I'd say those are the big injuries and issues I have to deal with, and those are typically injuries that they don't heal themselves very fast, and the activity in which created the stress oftentimes is the same activity that these athletes go back to. So it's always a matter of juggling the equation that I like to speak of, which is the relationship between stress and capacity. And for whatever reason, that athlete's capacity that stress, excuse me, exceeded their capacity at that given region. And it was their body's way of telling them they need to quiet down for a little bit. So those are always very, very tough, but they're fun at the same time.
Nice. So for tendinopathy, like you mentioned, do you think that is it because like they loaded too much or like do you think like landing at the right position also matters for tendinopathy?
Yeah, I do. I think it's a matter of a lot of, it's multifactorial, right? So like we try to oversimplify things, right? But I think the body is a very complex system of many intertwining factors, and those factors include things that we don't always think about, such as, sleep, recovery, nutrition, stress, right? Couple that with the activity of the jumping and sometimes if mechanics or you happen to land a little bit funny one day, you're a little bit fatigued, you don't get the same type of push off, so it throws off your rhythm a little bit, and some faulty mechanics maybe result, and certain tissues get stressed, injuries are oftentimes a result. So, I'm always playing that balance of allowing our athletes to try to recover, but at the same time allowing for the tissue to gain as much capacity as we possibly can. And what capacity, are we trying to deal with? Well, when we're talking with tendons, we've got to load the tendon, right? We've got to keep that tendon strong, whether it be, doing a lot of eccentric work, whether we do a lot of heavy resistance with slow speeds, whether it be doing a lot of isometrics. I like to change it up a little bit, teaching the tendon how to be resilient, how to have some stiffness to it. A tendon that has some stiffness is very athletic. But joints that tend to be too stiff create problems. So it's that balance and how it all kind of plays together, which really makes the job fun because you got to look at the athlete as a whole. You can't just look at them as a tendon. You got to look at them as a whole functioning body and how they all interplay together. I'm a big fan of watching videos of my athletes perform their task because it does lay the foundation as to like the stresses that could be, coming through a given region and how that particular athlete is coping with those stresses. So,
Nice, nice. So I always enjoy the conversation with track coaches or like physical therapists, whoever works with tracks, because they like to watch videos like tons of videos. So in terms of like let's just focus on sprinters and jumpers. Um, do you like do you like how many like let's say per video, like one athlete jump, like one high jump, like how many times do you like review that video?
oh, yeah, I think it's going to vary on a case by case basis. Like I said, I'm not getting in the weeds of trying to address somebody's jump mechanics. I know what my strengths are and my weaknesses are, and I know who I'm surrounded with and what their strengths and weaknesses are. And by no means am I somebody that's going to go looking at a jump video, whether it be a long jump or a triple jump, high jump even, and try to dissect what the problems are. But again, what I try to look for is just general things in terms of athletic performance, as what is the position when the body takes off, what is the position when the body lands, what type of stresses, is there a valgus stress at the knee, what's happening at the foot and ankle. Those gross things I'll be looking at potentially. And again, it's a lot of times in my world, I can lean on the specialists and who can tell me, I didn't like this particular landing. I didn't like the way this looked. And therefore that's what we're going to work on. When I say we, I mean they, the coach. And then when I say, okay, well, I know from my strengths and what my wheelhouse is that that tendon is irritated. It's not a big mystery oftentimes what the injury is, right? When somebody has a patellar tendinopathy or somebody has an Achilles tendinopathy, it's pretty straightforward. 9 times out of 10, you know what you're dealing with, right? So when you're dealing with a damaged tendon, we know certain things that are really, really beneficial to help that tendon. We know that rest is not always the answer, because what happens is if you would just take an athlete that has a tendinopathy and you pull them out of their sport and you don't let them jump or run for a given period of time and you don't let them do any type of rehabilitation, they may feel better temporarily, but we know that that tendon itself is still damaged. We know the tendon itself hasn't healed. We know the tendon may be less irritated, but the tendon qualities itself has not changed. So when that person goes back to doing those same activities, um, they're gonna suffer a lot of similar problems. So oftentimes back in the day, the whole rest thing, we would think we would be great, medical professionals by telling people to rest and focus on some other areas while that tissue heals. And then they get back and they're able to jump and you go, great, I did a great job. And then, a month later, they're in the clinic for the same exact thing because you really didn't do a great job. So we know we need to load that tendon. We need to get some good force, tensile forces through it to really strengthen those properties. And there's a lot of good research out there, whether it be from Karin Sabernagel to, the Alfredson protocols and stuff, whether it be, eccentrics or heavy slow resistance, like I talked about, or even isometrics. I think they all play a place. Isometrics are great for the analgesic effect. I think the key with all of it is you just got to add progressive load. You always got to continue to progress the load that you're putting through the tendon. You've got to add some type of elasticity training to your program, whether it be, hopping, jumping, skipping, those type of things. Because again, those properties of the tendon are vital for athletic performance. So I think and you can't do it every day. It's got to be very, very, periodized as to how you kind of plan and put your program together. I like to use blood flow restriction training a lot in a lot of my rehabilitation, especially early on when you can't put a whole lot of load through a tendon. Blood flow restriction allows for some analgesic effects as well. So I think it's a good way to kind of supplement what else they're doing. But yeah, to answer your question, I watched some video, but not a whole lot, especially in that population. When we start talking endurance runners and distance runners, I get a little bit deeper into what I want and what I expect and what I'm kind of hope for. And I'm very fortunate again that the coaches allow me to make some changes. The athletic trainers I work with allow me to make some changes within the gait form to try to make them as efficient as we possibly can. Give them some strategies. If somebody's having knee pain, some strategies could be, you know, increasing their cadence, shortening their stride. There are some cues I like to use. If somebody's having some, Achilles tendon issues, sometimes having them run downhill is actually beneficial compared to running uphill, and some different things that we know to offload certain tendons. I always call it, I like when I give lectures and speak, I talk about shifting load, right? So, a lot of my treatment in terms of our job in sports is to get our athletes back to sports as quickly as we possibly can. And our second job is to keep them injury free as often as we can, right? So if an athlete comes to me and they're dealing with a certain problem in a certain area, if I can safely get them back by altering their gait mechanics slightly and moving that stress to a different tissue that's better capable of handling it, I think everybody around me is going to be happy. The athlete's going to be happy because they're going to be continuing to play their sport. The coaches are happy because they're going to be able to, continue to utilize that player on the field or on the track. And guess what? The fans and the boosters are happy too because the athletes are on the court. So, and the field and the track. So, I think that's the ultimate goal is understanding what movements put more stress on certain tissue and understanding as a therapist and as a medical professional how I can influence movement to allow for that stress to be mitigated in other areas.
Cool, cool. Also glad that you brought up like when someone have like a Achilles tendon issue, instead of like uphill sprinting, you use downhill sprinting to like
Not
mitigate.
necessarily sprinting. I wouldn't necessarily always say sprinting, but sprinting puts a lot of pressure on the balls of your feet. And when you put pressure on the balls of your feet, your Achilles tendon is definitely loaded. So, that's one of the things you could do if somebody's having some Achilles pain and they're a sprinter, potentially pull them back a little bit, allow them to run maybe at slower speeds that don't create that same stress. And again, our body adapts to stresses we apply to it as long as we don't over apply those stresses, right? So we've got to find where that cutoff point is to what they can tolerate and where that threshold is to what they can't tolerate and keep them just south of that line so that they don't kind of continue to irritate it, but at the same time build up that tissue capacity to handle more.
Nice, nice. So, um, that lead me to another question, like, uh, like the previous like podcast you talk about like foot and ankle. So, can we like talk a little bit about like during like running, overall running, like when they land, where should they land? And like people always talk about dorsiflexion when they land. Like, is dorsiflexion means like land on the hill? That doesn't make sense to me.
So that's the $1 million question, right? So I have a viewpoint, I have a stance on how I believe people should land when they run, and that's not necessarily 100% supported in the literature, I'll say, right? I believe, and this is a believe, I call it a Scottism. This is something that I believe, and one of the things that I look for. I believe that first of all, I'm going to say I don't believe there's such thing as a midfoot landing, right? You can't land on your midfoot because your midfoot is your arch. So when you're talking about a midfoot landing, you're talking more about a neutral ankle position relative to the ground as it hits when it hits the ground. So it's a neutral ankle position. So you can either hit in a plantar flexed ankle position, a dorsiflexed ankle position, or a neutral ankle position. If you're landing in a plantar flexed ankle position, your forefoot is most likely to hit the ground. If you are landing in a dorsiflexed ankle position, your rear foot will hit the ground. Now, I believe that in sprinting, we can definitely see this, that you need to be landing with the balls of your foot making initial contact, right? You don't want to be too plantar flexed. So again, more of that neutral position, but that ball of the foot needs to make initial contact first. What you'll never see also a good sprinter landing on their rear foot. It just doesn't happen, right? But you will see some distance runners, whether it be, 800-meter runners and beyond that do have a heel strike. And I believe that heel striking is somewhat of a lazy foot posture. I believe that it's not an athletic foot posture. Whenever we do anything athletic in sports, we're always taught to be on the balls of our feet. Why? Because we can move, we're agile, we're quick, there's the spring. When you land on your foot has to go into this collapsing type of mechanics where your foot begins to pronate, your rear foot goes into eversion, your talus drops, you kind of get this little whipping occurring, your forefoot abducts, and then you hopefully have enough time to resupinate. Whereas when you land on the ball of your foot, oftentimes it's more of a load and explode, where you're really storing a lot of energy in your arch and your tendons, and then you're able to explode off. And I oftentimes, when I teach, have all my students stand up and have them run in place. And every single one of them, when they run in place, runs on the ball of their foot. It's not something I have to tell them. It's just the natural thing to do. So when you run, the goal of running is to land as close to your center of mass as you can. And when you land on the balls, or when you run in place, you're running on the balls of your foot. Now, when I tell them to, okay, now that you see how you naturally land, I want you to force landing on your heels. And it's very uncomfortable, right? So I always think that when people run fast, they're more likely to land on the balls of their foot. When they try to tone back that speed, they get lazy with their form, allowing their rear foot to contact the ground first. So, that doesn't mean that they can't be very, very competitive and good runners that land on their heel, but I believe they could potentially be better runners if they landed on the balls of their foot. Now, again, no change without consequences, right? So taking a rear foot runner and making them a forefoot runner isn't necessarily ideal for everybody in every situation. There's a time and a place to make that change. I can't make that change in the middle of a season because again, that tissue that we're going to change the stress to is maybe not able to deal with it. And I think that's why forefoot running got such a bad rap is for a while, people were talking about running barefoot and how barefoot running causes everyone to run on the balls of their feet. And then all these people were getting hurt. Why? Because their body wasn't able to deal with the change. It was too much, too fast, too soon. So I do believe that, again, landing close to your center of mass is ideal, and landing on the balls of your foot with more of a neutral ankle is ideal. That doesn't mean that you can't have success, and that doesn't mean that if somebody has an Achilles tendon issue, I may tell them to run a little bit more neutral, or maybe with a little bit of dorsiflexion to again push those loads in other areas temporarily. Orthotics and those type of things I like to utilize can also help unload tissue. But to circle back to your initial question, um, it is a really debated topic, and I think that in my world, I'd prefer a neutral ankle with a slightly forefoot contact opposed to any other contact.
Nice, nice. Because there they were talking about sprint mechanic. You also brought up Ralph Mann. And this is interesting because in his book, he also said that in high speed running, sprinting, there's like 10 degrees of 10 degrees of plantar flexion, actually. So you can create the loading of the arch and then explode.
Hmm. That paw
So,
back,
yeah,
that paw back that we're
yeah,
talking about a lot with like, your A skips and your B skips, really kind of getting to the ground, really slapping it and kind of pulling it back up, creating that force into the ground, right? You want
yeah,
force into the ground, that creates speed.
yeah. So, the other interesting thing about like sprinter is like foot training. So in terms of like strength and conditioning, we always do like deadlift, back squat, squat, whatever squat it is, power clean. But like, I think we don't put enough tension on the feet, or like we didn't train the feet enough. So like we talk about like loading the spring, like what would you do in terms of like when maybe warm up or like rehab to like train the arch or like train the foot?
So I agree with you, right? So all those lifts that you talked about, I think are great if you even do them barefoot. I think it's a great way. But you're going to get me on a little bit of my little soapbox here that I like to do. I'm a big believer in blood flow restriction training for the foot and ankle because the whole premise behind blood flow restriction training is that you can use submaximal load somewhere between 20 and 30% of your one rep max, and you are able to elicit a hypertrophy effect due to the buildup of lactic acid and the elicitation of protein synthesis and the release of hormones and IGF-1 and all in different pathways, the mTOR pathway being stimulated, all these different things that are have been found in the literature to be associated with heavy lifting can be achieved with the elicitation of blood flow restriction. Usually, when you use somewhere between 40 and 80% of their limb occlusion pressure and whatnot. So the reason I say the foot and ankle is a great place to utilize blood flow restriction is because oftentimes we don't load the foot enough. You can load the foot in like doing like calf raises, and the calf can be loaded adequately. But what about the small little foot intrinsics, right? They're muscles too, and they need to gain some strength. And a lot of those muscles in the foot and ankle are made up of both type 1 and type 2 fibers. So we do know that there are some power generating components to those musculatures, to those muscles. And so if you're doing an exercise in which you're doing like a balance exercise, not necessarily for balance, but because you're trying to elicit the foot intrinsic stimulation, why not throw blood flow restriction on while you're doing those exercises? Because again, the load that you're putting through the foot is not 70 to 80% of their one rep max tension, right? It's probably a lot less than that. So if I can stimulate other pathways, the metabolic stress pathway, to increase lactic acid buildup and what have you, to help facilitate a greater hypertrophic response, I think I'm going to benefit my athlete a lot by doing it. It doesn't hurt me anything to throw on the blood flow restriction cuffs when I'm doing a TheraBand exercise, right? How many people do TheraBand exercises for their foot and ankle? Everybody does, right? But I don't believe that those TheraBand exercises are challenging enough and number one, the bands aren't taught enough to create the tension. Two, I don't think many people do as many repetitions. Now, there was a study that showed that, you know, blood flow restriction versus low load resistance training, there's not much difference if you don't control for the repetitions, right? So if you do it till failure in both exercises to failure, you're going to get a very similar response. But very infrequently do most people do foot and ankle exercises to failure. So therefore, the blood flow restriction helps elicit that response a lot quicker. And I like to do, like I said, I like to do repetitions in the upwards of 60 repetitions per exercise, several sets, to ensure that I'm getting that fatiguing effect, that near failure effect when I'm doing my exercises.
Cool. I like this is the first time heard, heard someone use blood flow restriction training on their foot. Is it also helpful for like you mentioned like Achilles tendinopathy?
So yes, I do use it for Achilles tendinopathy, but when you're dealing with tendons, there is no replacing putting tension through that tendon. There are some studies that show that the tendon does respond to blood flow restriction therapy. No doubt that there's some studies that are showing positive results with that. That being said, I don't think there's never a substitute for the ability to load through a tissue with a good amount of weight. So blood flow restriction therapy should not take the place of heavy resistance training. It should not. It's a supplement, it's a tool. And if you can't elicit that for whatever reason, if the tissue can't handle it or you don't have the means to put that kind of tension through that tissue, then blood flow is great. But, especially like the Achilles tendon, that's an easy one to put a lot of tension through. The patellar tendon's an easy one to put a lot of tension through. But that doesn't mean I won't supplement it from time to time with some blood flow restriction to kind of put a different stress, a different stimulus through it. But I do like and lean towards just traditional heavy loading for those type of issues.
Cool. And another thing you also brought up a few days ago is about like doing strength exercise or like lift with landmine. Am I correct?
Hmm. Yeah.
So can you like kind of walk us through how do you like start or why do you start using landmine?
So that's a great question. I'll tell you why I started using it initially is because in the training room, we didn't in our athletic training room at one of our facilities I work at, we didn't have a squat rack. And one day we were trying to figure out how we can better load our athletes, right? And obviously you can get a squat rack and put it, but there wasn't a lot of space. And they did have a barbell and they did have a whole lot of bumper plates laying around. And I asked if we can start using them, and they said absolutely. And I said, great. Can you get me a landmine? And they said, sure. You know, they're like $20. They're cheap, right? So with a landmine, they take up very little space. And basically, the amount of exercises you can do with it is endless. Um, Everything from upper body to lower body, to single leg to double leg, to rotational activities, to explosive activities. I absolutely have fallen in love with what the landmine can do. I use it in every one of my sessions. I actually feel there's some merit to doing more of the explosive movements, such as like the cleans and the snatches and the jerks with a landmine, as opposed to with just a traditional barbell bilaterally. I think with using the landmine, you get a lot more rotational components to those movements, and you can still be explosive, and you can be explosive with a lot less weight, which is a lot safer too. And the movements tend to be a lot simpler when you start using the landmine versus, your true traditional Olympic lifts. Um, so those movements can be complex too. So they're simpler movements, easier to learn. They involve rotation. Most of our sports, running, and too, is a movement which the left hip and the right arm go together, and the right arm and the left hip go together. So there's that rotation around the spine that occurs. Um, Most of an offensive lineman throwing a block on a defensive end is not going straight. There's a rotational component to how he's trying to ward off that defender and shrug him to one side. Everything we do, there's movement that's in a rotational transverse plane type of movement. And I think that sometimes unless we train that, and we're not training that in the traditional, snatches and cleans, not to say that those movements aren't important. They absolutely should be utilized if you can. Maybe not necessarily all of them, but maybe you can do a high pull. Maybe you can do a quick pull off the ground to be explosive. Trap bar jumps and stuff like that are great. I think they're great. But I do think the landmine is a cool tool that could and should be implemented for many of our athletes, and because of the things I mentioned, the safety, the lightweight you can use, the rotational component. And again, I do a lot of single leg deadlifts with it. I do a lot of squatting, single leg squatting, curtsy squatting. I do a lot of overhead pressing. I do a lot of core work with it. I do a lot of different things with my landmine.
Nice, because I remember like a few days ago when we like kind of discussing about lifting during the season, I was saying like sometimes I don't like to lift like I don't like to do like traditional like back squat, heavy back squat during the season. So you mentioned like at this time probably like landmine is a better option for like lifting during the season. And I was like, oh yeah, why didn't I thought of that? That was like really cool, really amazing.
Yeah, it's during the season we have different goals, right? We want to keep the intensity high, but we want to keep the stress on the body somewhat low, right? So a way to remain explosive and powerful with great intent and move some weight, but do it in a safer way, maybe the landmine. Now, again, I'm not saying that it's for everyone. I'm sure there are other people out there that have their reasons and beliefs that, traditional Olympic lifting is the way to go. And I'm not going to necessarily say they're wrong, but I'm going to say we need to open our eyes to some other ways in which we can achieve similar results. And there's a time and a place for a lot of these different things.
Cool, cool. Since like in Lamma you also said about like rotational aspect of like how your body move. I want to like go back to like the foot and ankle because we just talked about like dorsiflexion or plantar flexion during landing. How about like is it like eversion or inversion or like supination or like what's the other? Man, I guess super
Pronation.
pronation. Yeah, yeah, yeah. During
Mm-hmm.
landing.
So when you land, your foot is traditionally in a slightly supinated posture. Okay. And then from there, it's a matter of what your foot mechanics are and what your alignment is that dictates what else happens. So traditionally, the foot lands supinated, it goes into a slightly pronated position and then resupinates, ideally. The question is, how fast does it pronate? How long does it pronate? How much pronation does it go through? What is the range of motion available at the joint? Are they able to resupinate for a nice rigid push-up? Because again, supination is a rigid foot posture. So when you hit the ground, you want to have some stability. When you go into a pronated position, that allows your body to absorb that shock. And when you go into pronation, your tibia internally rotates, your knee goes into a slight valgus, your femur internally rotates. There's a chain of events that occur that allows your body to absorb that stress and shock. And if it absorbs it too much and you're too compliant, then you don't have that rigidity for push off, which is a problem. And oftentimes, if you don't have the strength in your quad to help load the knee and to eccentrically control that absorption, that flexion, that's where problems can arise as well. So you can't just look at the foot. You got to look at the whole chain. And if the foot sometimes is, we call it pronating too much, oftentimes people go right to the foot and say, oh, we need to stop the pronation. Meanwhile, the foot is just doing what the body is asking it to do. And if you take away that foot's ability to pronate, you're taking away its compensatory strategy, and you may open up some other problems down the line as a result.
So when you see like let's say an athlete like he has some foot issue or like landing, it's not like so optimal. How do you know like or yeah, how do you know you should put like 30% time on the foot or like 30% time on the like glute like or like hamstring? How do you like figure out how much tension you should put on like which area?
I think you got to do a thorough evaluation. So, you just can't watch somebody run or watch somebody move. You got to actually get down to the actual your evaluation, your skills as my skills as a therapist that helps me identify asymmetries, that helps me identify, whether it be, if you're not testing, you're guessing. Have you heard that statement before? So, getting somebody, on an isokinetic device and or a dynamometer of some kind and making sure that you're looking at symmetries between certain muscle groups side to side, making sure that they're falling within their force to body weight ratios, torque to body weight ratios. So all of that plays a piece. Again, so many things are multifactorial, but you've got to have some benchmarks and some qualifiers that allow you to understand where there are. If they, every time you do a movement, you should be assessing how they do. It's not just doing the exercise to do the exercise, it's doing the exercise and you're evaluating how they look and how they move, what's their movement quality doing those movements.
Well, so I guess my question is like there's a lot of like therapists they focus the only focus on the feet and some of the like therapists they're gonna focus on hip. How do you like build like your own way to assess this?
I always say if you call yourself a foot therapist, you better also be a hip therapist. If you call yourself a hip therapist, you better be a foot therapist because they work together. And this is where the statement I make now oftentimes gets me in trouble, but I oftentimes say the knee is the dumb joint of the lower leg. And the reason I say it's the dumb joint of the lower leg is that it's the follower. Its movement and its function and its position is greatly influenced by what happens above it at the hip and what happens below it at the foot and ankle. And oftentimes it's the slave to those two joints. It really acts as either it's able to compensate and move in that position or it's not for its biomechanical alignment, which can cause problems also. So, it really doesn't have a mind of its own. It really has to function as a result of what's happening above it and below it.
Nice. I enjoyed this. I enjoyed this. So enough for like foot and ankle. I also know like because a few days ago you also brought up like Achilles tendon rupture and how you help your athlete. It's a football player, right? How you help him return to play.
All of them. I deal with a lot of different. Unfortunately a lot of Achilles ruptures last year. Fortunately, it's one of my favorite things to treat. I love it. One of the reasons I love it is because it's one of those things that I really think we as therapists have a great influence on, and I think it's one of those things where it's not a really painful type of injury, even post-operatively. It's they
Not
athletes
painful?
tend to not, no, they tend not to have a lot of pain, even when it first happens. They feel like the typical complaint is they feel like somebody kicked them in the back of the leg or somebody hit them with a bat in the back of the leg or somebody stepped on their heel and it just pops and they're not traditionally in a lot of pain. And then after the operation, they're traditionally also not in a lot of pain. They're limited with their mobility and their function for a while. But in terms of the pain, and like when you have like an ACL, there's some battling that has to take place. There's some real initial soreness, and then they've got to take it through that bending phase and make sure you get full extension. And then you started, working on your flexion, making sure you get past 90 at a certain, in a certain time frame, and that your knee doesn't get, too fibrotic. And you don't typically have that with Achilles, ruptures and repairs. They typically do pretty well with regards to pain control, and then it's just a matter of, protecting the repair from themselves, right? So how can you make sure that that wound is closed and healing? How do you make sure that they keep the infection chances down? How do you make sure that they're not stretching that tendon too much and allowing it to really, start to incur that creep? That is a really negative thing for those tendons, which allows an athlete to lose their explosiveness. That's the worst thing that can happen, right? Well, there's a lot of bad things that can happen, but losing explosiveness in a runner or a jumper or a sprinter is very, very bad, right? So we want to make sure that we maintain some of that tissue integrity as we're going through the rehab process. So, I always talk about with Achilles tendon repairs that the three main focuses are number one, tissue healing. Number two, making sure that we don't produce any excessive elongation of that tendon. And then three, making sure we get them as strong as we possibly can in that calf musculature as quick as we can. If you do those three things well, I think you're going to have a lot of positive outcomes with your Achilles.
Cool. So last year there's also a lot of, like Achilles tendon rupture or like Achilles tendon injury in NFL. So can you like kind of walk us through your process of return to play?
Yeah, sure. Return to play. I think it's going to vary a little bit. If we looked at like Aaron Rodgers last year, I like talking about this. I am a Jet fan, I will say. So that injury, not only was it my favorite injury, last year was my least favorite injury because my guy went down with it. But they talked about him getting back quick, right? And what were the factors he was looking at? And he's a 40-year-old guy who plays quarterback. It's his lead leg, so he's not gonna have to push off. He's not traditionally a running quarterback, so he doesn't have to be super explosive. He just needs to have adequate strength so he can run around a little bit and protect himself. As long as there's been adequate time for that tissue to heal and not incur that creep. So he was talking about potentially getting back at like the 5.5 month mark, 5.5, 6 month mark, somewhere in there, depending, right? And a lot of the creeps, a lot of the studies regarding, the tendon, complete healing of that tissue usually plateaus around 5.5, 6 months. Um, and really at the end of the day, it's about, how strong can we get that athlete back to? Can they jump? Can they hop? Can they, what does their symmetry look like? And there is a risk reward, right? There, when you get back early, you are like Aaron Rodgers, if he did get back, he was willing to take a little bit of risk. His big risk, in my opinion, wasn't re-rupturing that tendon. It was just getting it to be stretched out a little bit too much, and he was going to lose that explosiveness and that power. But for the things that he needs, he doesn't need to be super powerful. Now, again, if he was a 22-year-old running back, different story, right? That athlete needs to be a lot more explosive. Their career is going to be a lot longer, so you need to kind of weigh that into the equation as well. So there's a lot of factors. And again, Aaron Rodgers, what else did he have that maybe some other people don't have the ability to kind of get? Whether it be, he did use blood flow restriction training early on as part of his training, which again is something I'm a huge believer in, especially for Achilles repairs. It's my favorite thing. I use it day one post-op. I'll use it on the contralateral side initially to try to get some of the systemic effects. I will use it on the involved side shortly thereafter, usually about the 1.5, 2 week mark during certain things, just to try to mitigate and minimize as much of that calf atrophy and that lower leg atrophy as I possibly can. But he probably had some type of stem cell injection, whether it helps or not, who knows? He might have had some other type of cutting edge kind of things. I don't even want to, speculate. I have ideas as to what maybe some things he used that kind of put him on the healing side, some experimental kind of things, we'll call it, that may have promoted some earlier healing. So I think he was at an advantage, but again, he is in a position in his career where he was willing to take that risk, right? But I'd say most people get back. I'm comfortable getting my athletes back. Again, it's time based, but it's also performance based, and somewhere in the 8, 9 month mark, I think is fair,
Yeah. So
depending on the athlete, depending on the position.
yeah. So let's say it's a younger athlete, like college student, like most of the athletes you deal with. Um, let's say it's a running back, younger athlete, a running back. How like what are the benchmark you think you need to reach so they can like start like doing some hops? And what are the benchmark you think they need to reach so they can do a little bit like running, a little bit change of direction movement?
Is for me, it's like you do this, you do it well, no pain, you can do this. You do this well, you have no pain, no setbacks, you can do this. So it's a stepwise gradual approach. The things, it's the typical you walk before you run, right? You crawl, you walk, you run. Um, in this, you're in a boot, you're in a shoe, you're walking, you're doing strengthening exercises on your calf. Can you do a single leg calf raise? Can you do bilateral hops? Can you do single lateral hops in place? Can you do forward hops on two legs? Can you do forward hops on one leg? Can you do, a box jump? I always we do a lot of aqua running early on to alter G running before they do regular running, and then they do running before they do cutting. So it's all of these kind of steps along the way, seeing how they respond and, making sure. There's a great article, I think it was Baxter in like 2020, talked about, and it was mainly for Achilles tendinopathies, but you'll get the gist of it. And I think it was 4 phases of exercises, and it went about how much tension is put through the Achilles tendon with each movement. And it was a good progression. So you can see, like, hey, listen, if I'm looking at rate of force, this exercise is less than this exercise. If you're looking at the amount of actual force, not rate of force, but the actual force that goes through the tendon during this movement, this is far superior or more demanding than this. And it was a really nice phase-wise approach to start implementing that. And again, I typically don't get my athletes running until, somewhere between the 3 and 4 month mark, depending. And again, get them in the Alter G first and see how they feel. 70% of their body weight, go up to 80%, 90%. Once they get to 90%, I usually start them on the ground, see how they respond there. Slow speeds first, gradually increasing their speeds. There's got to be a plan, right? You just can't just go willy-nilly at it. And again, I don't think there's a one size fits all. For me, it's very progression, it's very criteria based as to how they look during certain movements and what do we need to get them back to.
Nice, nice. I enjoy this. It's like I enjoy everything like goes with sprinting, running, or like movement. Especially
Hmm.
like we talk about like return to play and like how the ankle like move during sprinting. I love this.
Me too.
So that's basically all the question I have for you today. So for those who are interested in what we're talking about today, no matter it's like return to play, fit an ankle, and blood flow restriction training, where can they reach out to you?
Best way to reach me is go on Instagram to scottgreenberg.dpt. That's probably the best way to find me. I'm pretty good with answering, questions in my, drop into my messages, leave me a message. I'm happy to respond. Um, yeah, that's probably the best way.
Nice, nice.